Good morning, and thank you for joining us for the Illinois 60 by 25 Network Conference. We're going to kick off this year's conference by hearing from members of our Student Advisory Council.
Hi, my name is Anushnath Kearney. I use she, her pronouns, and I go to Bloomington High School in Bloomington, Illinois.
My name is Isabella Hernandez. I go to Auburn High School and I am a senior this year. Very exciting.
Hi, my name is Carol Penne and I am currently a senior at Evanston Township High School, also called ETHS by the locals.
Hi, my name is Joanna Renetto and I go to North Chicago Community High School and I'm a junior.
I am committed to UW Milwaukee, which is really exciting, and I plan on majoring in public health. I would love to work for the World Health Organization or for like the CDC. I think that would be really cool and just help people around the world.
After graduation, I aim to attend a 4-year undergraduate college. Although I am still exploring my options in terms of career paths, I hope to continue my work in advocacy and service wherever I go.
So currently my plan right now after graduating high school is to earn a degree in psychology because I'm really fascinated by human behavior and especially language development and acquisition. So while in college, I also want to continue to grow my art skills and hopefully one day start a small business.
I want to major in biology because I want to become a dermatologist.
I also was recently diagnosed with depression and anxiety, and I got a 504 for school. So that has been like a really big change in the last couple years of having to like navigate, school a little bit differently because of my recent diagnosis.
The prospect of moving away from college is daunting, but I'm excited to set off on my own and delve into like the new experience.
So I think that the biggest thing that people need to take away from this who are watching is that you need to make the classroom more fun. Applying what they found in the classroom with that hands-on experience to something outside the world, which is what we really want students to do. Um, and I think that by doing that, you're setting up kids not only to go to college, but if they don't want to pursue a college career, then going to want something that they're passionate about. Like if I didn't wasn't really sure about going the science route and I did a science lab and I loved it, I would go through science because I figured out that that's what I really like doing. Or being able to do modules in statistics with real life statistics and doing simulations in AP US history or AP government or even world history. I think that if you're able to make the classroom more fun, it'll be more engaging for the students, and also students will be more excited to learn and potentially even be more excited to go to college and see what life in the workforce is really about.
Because it's a public school, we have a variety of different students from different backgrounds, parents of different education levels, different cultures. So, one thing that I've noticed that really divides students in terms of their goals after high school is the relationships they have with teachers in school. A big thing is the way that we discipline kids in high school. A lot of times students will not feel supported and they'll act out, and then we'll discipline them without giving them a chance to explain why they're acting out, what's going on at home, what they need from the school. And so then kids who are disciplined rather than nurtured a lot of times will have worse chances at being able to pursue a post-secondary education because their relationship with the people who facilitate an education with them isn't good, so they won't feel comfortable pursuing a further education.
I think that something that they could do is probably listen to their students more. I remember like my junior year, and not only was it difficult because, we were going back in person, and that, junior year is just like hard in general. But I was also going through a lot of like family problems, and I think having my teachers there to try and ask me like, "Hey, how was your day?" I think that would have been really helpful and make me feel like they care.
I think that in order for students to be successful, schools really have to be more equitable, and this is in regards to school lunches being more accessible to all students, making school sports and clubs more accessible by making like less expensive gear so people feel like they can try out the sports that they love, and also taking away the stigma surrounding AP classes as sort of the hard classes that only the super smart people can take. And I guess in a more personal sense, making classrooms more engaging in the subjects that we're learning. And I feel like the best way to do that is to take kids on field trips where they can really experience and surround themselves with what they're learning in class, especially for science and language classes, because those have more real life applications, and that would really get kids like excited about what they're learning and really open up their creativity and their intrinsic motivation.
Education is a really powerful tool of resistance and of advocacy. A lot of people go into government hoping to change things, and they do. But education is really underrated as a tool of changing people's minds and hearts, and the power that educators and policymakers have to further students in their lives, not just as students and people who work, but also just as people who are community members, is super powerful, and the responsibility to aid students in their life paths is enormous. So I think just really remembering that in decision making as people who are very high up in the education system, um, remembering that you have a really big role to play in children's lives and that they can make really great change if you just let them.
What a powerful message from our Student Advisory Council. A big thank you to members of our council for helping to ground us as we begin this year's conference. I ask that you hold one of them in your mind as you go through the next 3.5 days. I'm Edith Juguna, and I'm the Network Director. On behalf of the network organizers, Advance Illinois, Education System Center at NIU, and the Illinois Student Assistance Commission, thank you all for being here. We know that these are challenging times, and we appreciate you making the time to join us. This is our largest conference yet, with over 700 registrants, and we're thrilled to have you. As we enter the 3rd year of living with the pandemic, I'm struck by how COVID continues to impact all aspects of society, but especially our schools. The toll on both adults and young people is real. It's also clear that much of the burden from the pandemic's disruption has fallen on historically disadvantaged groups. But our resolve and commitment remain strong in the face of these challenges. Our leadership communities and partners continue to implement innovative strategies to support young people to ensure that they're successful after high school. You'll hear over the next few days how communities continue to reimagine how young people prepare for their future, from real progress in reducing college remedial course enrollment to new innovations like virtual career exploration activities. We had a session for newcomers earlier this morning, but in case you missed it, I'll share some background on the network. When Advance Illinois Education System Center at NIU and the Student Assistance Commission kicked off the 60x25 network over 9 years ago, it was in response to the emergence of local collaboratives across the state that were working to increase post-secondary attainment. We recognized a need for a coordinated statewide infrastructure able to support these efforts. So in 2013, our 3 organizations came together around an idea. What if we created a network to help connect communities so that they could more easily learn from one another and support each other and serve as exemplars to others on how to use the collective impact approach to bolster student success from cradle to career? The network's name reflects the Illinois P20 Council's goal and the Lumina Foundation's goal that by 2025, 60% of Illinois adults have a high-quality college degree or post-secondary credential. From the first conference in 2014, we've seen a statewide movement develop that's become an effective peer-to-peer learning network for local action. It has a direct connection to state policy priorities and supports both student and community level outcomes. From there, the Illinois 60x25 leadership communities were born. The leadership community designation recognizes communities that do the hard work to pull together partnerships of folks from diverse sectors and use collective impact as an organizing principle. They determine the geographic boundaries they want to focus on, they commit to using data for continuous improvement, they identify a backbone organization and develop an action plan. Leadership communities have a shared goal of strengthening connections between student learning and employment opportunities in their communities. This helps advance both economic development and student post-secondary achievement goals. Leadership communities receive a number of supports through the network, including funding, access to education and workforce data, and targeted technical assistance. We began with 6 leadership communities in 2015 and are now 18 communities strong. We were excited to welcome 2 new communities in 2021, Black Hawk Region Pathways and Boone County. I take this opportunity to recognize leadership communities. Thank you for leading the way. As the network continued to develop, we realized that we needed additional voices to help guide the work. So 5 years ago, we established a guiding team comprised of folks from diverse sectors to help inform both the kind of work we do and how we do it. This past year, the guiding team has been critical in helping the network consider which new partners we should engage more deeply as we work towards more equitable post-secondary attainment. Thank you, guiding team members, for your thought partnership. In addition to collective impact, equity is a guiding principle of the network. To deepen our focus on equity, last year we established a Student Advisory Council. You just heard from a few of them. The council is comprised of students from leadership communities, and the goal is to help us better understand student needs and how we as a network can support those needs. We've already learned a lot from them, including how to discuss labor market information in a way too accessible to young people as they consider their career choices. Please be sure to join tomorrow's session on Student Voices to hear directly from them. Our deeper focus on equity extends to this year's annual meeting. Our theme is Equity First, building towards a better future and revitalizing learning. We've had 2 years of a pandemic that has pushed equity to the forefront. In addition, statewide work this year showed that disparities in student attainment persist. Even though Illinois is on track to reach 60% by 2025, outcomes remain inequitable across demographic groups. We'll have a big announcement at the end of the opening plenary that will highlight the network's response to this continued challenge. Now that we're all on the same page about why we are here, let me preview for you our exciting program. We have a stellar group of speakers, and there's something for everyone at this year's conference. We'll hear from national leaders, elevate best practices from communities and partners, and learn from students about how to support them. And now a few logistical issues. If you haven't already, please be sure to sign up for more of the amazing sessions we have in store over the coming days. All sessions will be recorded and will be available on the website after the conference. So if you're torn about which session to attend, fear not. I want to thank a number of people who made this conference possible. The Conference Planning Committee, Jim O'Connor from Advance Illinois, Sarah Clark and Emily Raska from Ed Systems, Sam Nelson and Jasmine Jeton Gonzalez from the Illinois Student Assistance Commission. Thanks for all the time and thoughtfulness you put into planning the conference. I also want to thank the speakers who have taken the time to talk with us and prepare outstanding presentations that will equip us with information we can act on and tools we can use when we return to our communities. On behalf of the network organizers, thanks again for being here. We are honored to work with so many people across the state who are committed to ensuring that Illinois students have the knowledge and skills they need to succeed. And now it's my pleasure to welcome our plenary speakers, Dr. Courtney Brown, President of Strategic Impacts and Planning, and Shauna Davis, Strategy Director for Participation at Community Colleges at the Lumina Foundation. They are joined by Emily Raska, Director of State Policy and Strategy at Education Systems Center at NIU. If you have questions during the presentation, please drop them in the Q&A and we'll have some time for presenters to respond.
Good morning. This is Courtney Brown, and I've really been looking forward to this event, and I'm delighted to be with all of you, even as I sit in Indiana, just next door to you. So at Lumina, we share the same urgent mission that you do to help more citizens earn college degrees and credentials and thrive in our fast-changing world. Lumina is a private foundation committed to racial equity and making opportunities for learning beyond high school available to all. You can go to the next slide. As Edith mentioned right before, in 2008, we proposed the goal that 60% of Americans attain high quality degrees or credentials by 2025, a goal that you've championed across Illinois, along with 45 other states. Today's hosts, the 60 by 25 network, as your name makes clear, is spearheading this effort to help students, workers, and employers across Illinois through the power of learning. Achieving this goal and our broader mission has never been more urgent. In a world where post-high school education is crucial to good jobs and better lives, too many Americans are being shut out and left behind. Many are Black, Hispanic, Latino, or Native American. Eager to learn, earn, and contribute their talents, they're overlooked and forced out by systemic barriers. This is one of the biggest challenges facing our country. Next slide. John Marcus's article in last month's Hechinger report lays out the high stakes. He underscores the consequences of the alarming drop in the number of Americans going to college, down nearly 1 million since the start of the pandemic and nearly 3 million over the past decade. What he describes will be of no surprise to any of you. People without education past high school earn significantly less than those with bachelor's degrees and are more likely to be unemployed and live in poverty. They're more prone to depression, live shorter lives, need more government assistance, pay less in taxes, divorce more frequently, and vote and volunteer less often. They're also more vulnerable to the allure of authoritarianism that jeopardizes our democracy. Men in particular of all races have disproportionately stopped going to college. Their undergraduate enrollment rate is down by more than 10% since the start of the pandemic. They have stepped off the path of the middle class, John Marcus writes, resulting in grave economic, social, and health implications for them and their families. These chilling trends make today's discussions vitally important. As the theme suggests, it's time to revitalize learning and build toward a better future, always putting equity first. For all of us, educators, employers, community leaders, policymakers, and advocates, we have our work cut out for us. This is a great challenge, but it's also our greatest opportunity. Moving the needle on equitable attainment is going to take every ounce of our smarts and our grit. Where we stand now and your role in making things better is what I'd like to explore today. Next slide, please. In Indiana, my adopted home state, where Lumina is headquartered, our Higher Education Commissioner, Teresa Lubbers, is retiring after an impressive 13-year run. As she departs, she gave a vision for education that struck a chord with me. She called for higher education to offer Americans affordable, relevant, flexible pathways with the assurance that the degree or credential is a valued measure of competency. To do this, she said, we must make higher education work for people who need different pathways to attain the benefits of higher education. That's a pretty good blueprint, simply stated, for what we're trying to achieve, not only in Indiana, Illinois, and the Midwest, but across the nation. The US has fallen from 3rd to 12th since 2000 among 38 member states of the OECD in the number of adults 25 to 34 with degrees. That's behind Canada, Korea, Russia, and many others. Next slide. Today, only half of Americans have the education they need to thrive in our global economy. Our national attainment rate is at 51.9%, which you can see on our Stronger Nation online tool. We've made progress. So we're up 14 percentage points since 2009, and a few states have reached their goal, or they're very close. Next slide. But progress at times seems agonizingly slow, and the numbers are far worse for Black, Hispanic, and Native American students, revealing devastating degree attainment gaps linked to race and ethnicity. Next slide, please. Illinois is a representative example. You are doing better than the national average, with just over 55% of citizens holding college degrees or short-term credentials. When you add those workforce credentials, certificates, and certifications, Illinois' attainment rate increased by nearly 14 percentage points since 2009. Only 11 states are ahead of Illinois. Next slide. But racial gaps persist. While more than 74% of Asian students and nearly 53% of whites in Illinois earned a degree, just 32% of Black adults and 23% of Hispanic adults have. That's why the Illinois Board of Higher Education's recently approved strategic plan elevates equity along with sustainability and growth as the keys for the future of higher ed in Illinois. Simply put, success and growth in Illinois and in every state depends on closing these gaps. Unfortunately, COVID actually widened them and put a spotlight on the fact that the promise of the American opportunity has always been in sharp contrast with our nation's legacy of racial discrimination. Our racial reckoning may have been sparked by the murders of George Floyd and countless others, but the root causes reach back well over a century. Lack of access to quality learning after high school has denied millions of Blacks, Hispanics, Native Americans, and low-income students the chance to secure good jobs and advance economically. The consequences were driven home dramatically over the last 2 years. Black, Indigenous, and people of color have been dying from COVID at disproportionate rates because they're more likely to work in essential jobs. For them, working from home is out of the question. The result is literally deadly. Last year, the National Center for Health Statistics reported that the average life expectancy decreased 2.7 years for Black people and 1.9 for Hispanic people between 2019 and the first half of 2020. A system of learning and work that leaves people behind based on their race, ethnicity, or income is unacceptable. This crisis, as I said, is our greatest opportunity. When we help those who need it the most, we lift up our entire nation and generations to come. But to find the right solutions, we need to truly understand today's students. Next slide, please. As you all know, he or she is no longer 18 years old, fresh out of high school and headed to a 4-year campus and a lifelong job. That description is about as current as mustard-colored rotary phones that hung in your kitchen or cars without seatbelts. Among today's students, 42% are students of color. Nearly 40% are older than 25. Half are paying their own bills. Nearly 2/3 work, at least part-time. 1 in 4 are raising children, and 1/3 aren't sure where their next meal is coming from. Given these stresses, it's not surprising that while 2 million people enter post-secondary education in the US each year, 8 years later, a full third have no degree and are no longer enrolled. Next slide, please. In total, about 36 million Americans are stopouts. Those are people with some college, but no degree. These numbers rose 22% from 2014 to 2019. And given the steep declines in enrollments, they're likely to have grown even higher in the last 2 years. Next slide, please. It's especially prevalent in our most populous areas, putting Illinois in the top 5 states for this unfortunate trend, along with California, Texas, New York, and Florida. The latest figures show Illinois with nearly 1.8 million stopouts as of 2019. Next slide. But if we look at the same data as a percentage of adults with some college no degree, rather than a population number, you can see Illinois is still in the top 5, with over 26% of adults with some college but no degree. Next slide. Sliced another way, you can see that while 47% of adults in Illinois have a degree, half as many were on the path to a degree when for whatever reason they had to stop out. If only half of those individuals had completed an associate's or bachelor's degree in Illinois, you would be over 70% attainment once you add the short-term credentials. So what's happening? The biggest reason to stop out is money. No surprise there. Rising tuition puts college out of reach for far too many Americans, causing many to debate if it's even worth it. From 2019 to 2020, the number of high school graduates who enrolled in college fell from 66% to 62.7%. But resources aren't the only reason students stop out. Sometimes it's not being able to pass developmental math, or it's too little time with counselors, or it's something as simple as a flat tire, a serious setback given that many students live off campus and work. Slowing or reversing the stop out trend is essential. Next slide. We are beginning to see a glimmer of good news. So a new report by the National Student Clearinghouse found that the 6-year college completion rate for first-time college students earning bachelor's or associate's degrees is at 62.2%. That's up 1.2 percentage points from the previous year. Even better, these completion rates for June 2021 graduates rose among older, more racially and ethnically diverse students, and those attending community colleges. And Black students experienced the largest increase, a jump of nearly 2 percentage points to 44.3% completing degrees. The report shows that 32 of 46 states that established goals for increasing attainment reported hikes in college completion rates. That's compared to just 12 states last year. And Illinois was up 1 percentage point. We still have far to go, but these are certainly welcome steps forward. So I've talked about the immense challenges we face, but this is also true. Helping to repair lives and strengthen our nation through education and training is the opportunity of a lifetime. We see states, schools, employers, and funders taking the right steps. These include adult promise programs, employer-paid tuition partnerships, competency-based pathways, stackable credentials that save time and money. And they include easier admission and transfer policies, smart use of disaggregated student data, text access to mentors and counselors, and increased funds to help students navigate emergencies. It also includes infusions of support for historically Black colleges and universities and community colleges. My colleague Shauna will share some of those in a moment. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned earlier, your Illinois Board of Higher Education's 2021 strategic plan lays out clear paths to equity, sustainability, and growth. Also impressive, and we're happy to support, your statewide equity plan chaired by Chicago State University, Advance Illinois, Partnership for College Completion, and the Illinois Community Colleges Board Workforce Equity Initiative. You and other states are on the right track because the fact is we know what to do. We know how to help students enroll, stay in school, and graduate. We know how to move closer to 60 by 25 because we've been doing it for more than a decade. But it will take all of us sustaining our communities, maintaining our investments, and acting with the creativity and urgency this moment demands to get it done. Next slide, please. Higher education has always faced a challenge to assure equity, but today's circumstances demand that we address this head on. We need sustained, equity-minded, broad-based proactive efforts. We need coordinated education, economic development, and workforce policies. We believe, as you do, that achieving fair and just outcomes for people of color and everyone who wants to learn must be central to the mission of higher education. Quite simply, education and learning equal human emancipation, a right that we all share. We can't do it without you. We need your leadership and partnership. Together, we can ensure that everyone in our home states and far beyond can learn, earn, and help their families flourish and contribute their talents to a brighter future. That really is the true goal of 60 by 25. So for that, I'll stop for now and turn it over to Emily. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Courtney. Good morning, everyone. My name is Emily Ruska. I'm Director of State Policy and Strategy at Education Systems Center at Northern Illinois University, one of the 3 network organizers here. And I'm here wearing my hat as a staffer for the College and Career Readiness Committee of the Illinois P20 Council. We've been undertaking some work, particularly on this topic of equity in post-secondary attainment. As both Edith and Courtney have noted, our current state goal is 60% by 2025, and that goal is inclusive of post-secondary degrees and credentials, including some of those stackable credentials that Courtney was mentioning. And we have made significant progress towards it, and this goal was set in alignment with research from the Lumina Foundation and in the greater movement nationally around driving up post-secondary attainment, and it was one of the founding factors of our network here. Again, we've made some significant progress since that goal was set in 2009 by the Illinois P20 Council, but we recognize that those gaps persist much in the way that Courtney was just describing. These gaps in attainment are both by racial demography as well as socioeconomic demography, where we see significant gaps. The way I think about this is that if post-secondary attainment is the measure of the overall health of our education and workforce development system, we're far from healthy right now where we see these gaps. Equity has also been an increasing focus for our state and nationally. We have a number of different efforts in Illinois, including a Thriving Illinois, the strategic plan that Courtney was just referencing from the Board of Higher Ed, various initiatives having to do with racial equity and socioeconomic equity, statewide efforts, including across all of our agencies to explore issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion, emerging tools and efforts from our secondary and earlier education space, including the Equity Journey Continuum that we'll be hearing about from Superintendent Ayala in just a couple of days here, as well as a number of different task forces and commissions having to do with equity and access when it comes to workforce development and how that is a part of this space. But really, again, thinking about how this pandemic that we are still in the middle of has disproportionately impacted communities of color and low-income communities, both in terms of how people are engaging with education, how education is delivered, how people make decisions about their lives, as well as the deep impacts on the economy, and particularly for families and communities, and the changing nature of work. And as we continue to grapple with these challenges, that those impacts are shaping how people are making decisions and experiencing the systems that we are working so hard to create and uphold and improve. So recognizing these inequities in post-secondary attainment, the Illinois State Legislature has charged the Illinois P20 Council with updating the 60 by 25 goal and saying it's not enough to have one North Star that says 60% by 2025 if we are consistently leaving significant populations behind, especially given the fact that our state is continuing to change demographically. Our state is diversifying racially. We have a lot of changing dynamics at play. And so the P20 Council has been charged with updating that 60% goal to include equity-focused targets aimed at closing these gaps. I like to include this image when talking about equity because it helps us think about when it comes down to brass tacks, when it comes down to the policy and practice of impacting these inequitable outcomes, what it means is trying to figure out the ways that the different types of supports and services that individuals might need based on their particular circumstances. The same bike is not going to work for every single person. And so we have to figure out what those adjustments might be in order to really drive equitable outcomes, not just equal access to opportunity. One of the pieces of work that has been in the background as we have been working on getting these equity targets developed is acknowledging that we need to ground any recommendations and any targets in data and understanding where we are currently and where we might be going if we don't change the status quo. To that effect, the Midwestern Higher Education Compact developed a projection study that helps us understand better what things would look like under status quo circumstances. This study was grounded in Illinois-based data from our colleagues at the State Board of Education, the Community College Board, the Board of Higher Education. It also included references to national data sources as well, including the census, to help understand our changing demography, as well as the frameworks put forth by the Lumina Foundation to account for post-secondary subassociate credentials in the post-secondary space. So what I'm going to do now is going to walk through some of our data, both from this study as well as just general data to get a snapshot of where are we currently, where are we seeming to go based on these projections, and what does that mean for both policy and practice before we can take a chance to learn from Shauna about some examples of really impactful work nationally. Some of the key findings of the MEC study is that probably unsurprisingly, that without action, these gaps across demography will persist and in some cases worsen. Low-income Illinoisans, Black Illinoisans, Latinx Illinoisans, the gaps that they have in attainment will not change if we don't take significant action to help be more inclusive in our post-secondary education and workforce space. The second core finding is that increasing enrollment and completion to parity with their white peers or non-low income peers would not be enough to eliminate gaps in attainment, because we're talking about decades and decades of barriers and challenges in terms of access and completion, but that we would need to accelerate above and beyond parity in enrollment rates in order to make a significant dent in attainment gaps overall. And then the third finding is that thinking about when we're turning the corner from setting goals to working in policy and practice, that targeting a narrower age band may be more actionable from a policy standpoint to say, how do we attract more folks in the sort of middle adult range back into education and workforce to complete those degrees and address those stopouts that Courtney was just describing. So what is our status quo? Where will we go? Where will we be if we don't make significant change in terms of our policy and practices? MEC developed two status quo models in their projection study. One is a constant rate, which is the most conservative and just says if we held the same constant rate from 2018, where would we be? And given the different rates of growth of population, underlying population, the total numbers of folks would change, but the rates would be maintained. The bottom table here shows a historical growth rate model, which accounts for some of the historical growth rates in enrollment or completion in the state. But as you can see here, the gaps still remain very large in even accounting for historical rates of growth. So again, our call to action here is that without action, we won't see a change in our outcomes. But let's take a little bit of a dive back into the pipeline, earlier in the pipeline. Taking a look at our four-year graduation rates, while we had been making some progress in graduation rates, and particularly for Black and Latinx students in Illinois, COVID and the resulting educational impacts have had an impact on graduation rates in the 2021 high school graduating class. And there are still gaps across these different demographic groups early on in the pipeline. And if we were to look even before graduation, we would see those gaps as well. And so accounting for that, we think about what does it mean when we're taking a look at enrollment? I know Courtney spoke to sort of general enrollment trends, but thinking about what does it actually look like in our state right now in terms of the most recent graduating classes and where they're enrolling. We have seen a decline in overall enrollment, and that decline has been a little bit more concentrated in our community college system. But compared to our regional peers, and compared to the top 5 state median rate, which this map on the right comes from the MEC dashboard, you know, we are still behind some of our peer states here, but we have room for growth. When we take a look at enrollment by race and ethnicity over time in our four-year institutions, the two visuals from the top are from the Thriving Illinois report from IBHE. We've seen significant declines in Black student enrollment at four-year institutions in our state, but hopefully we have seen, to give us some hope, we have seen an increase in Latinx enrollment in our post-secondary institutions. But as you can see in the bottom where we compare ourselves to both the region as well as the top 5 states, we are far behind where enrollment has been in other places. And there's a lot to learn from other states who are doing important work to be more inclusive in their enrollments and in their ultimate success for Black, Latinx, and low-income students. When we look at folks who are older adults, where are we falling in the national scheme here? We have about 5% of folks who are older with a degree or credential or who are currently enrolled in college. And that puts us at sort of in the red here compared to some of our other peer states. And I know Shauna is going to speak to some examples from California, which is by comparison in the top 5 state median here. We have a lot to learn in terms of what it means to re-engage adults in education to get them to that post-secondary degree or credential. As we move through the pipeline, it's not enough to enroll students, but also we need to retain them and get them to completion. For full-time freshmen at our 4-year institutions in the state, we see gaps across the board, regardless of institution type, for Black and Latinx students in Illinois. And this is a kind of key metric for us to think about. What does it mean to, once folks are in the door of our post-secondary institutions, to adequately support them? This is where pieces like considering how developmental education shapes the student experience and whether that slows or leads to stop out for students is really critical. And we'll have some sessions later in the conference talking about some of the strategies to address developmental education needs, for example. And again, for graduation, when we turn the corner from retention to ultimately that completion rate, we do see significant gaps in completion across our various types of institutions, both for Black and Latinx Illinoisans that are enrolled. So, you know, when we're looking at our universities, even our community colleges, we still see these gaps across the board. And so it really begs the question of what are we going to do to better support students to complete? This also brings into play cost issues and other barriers that Courtney was noting and that I know Shauna will also speak to in some other examples. And so when we look at our comparison to the states in the Midwest, as well as the sort of top 5 states in the nation, we're behind the 8 ball when it comes to graduation rates. For example, in 2018, Illinois' graduation rate at our public 4-year institutions for Black students was 33%, whereas the median for the top 5 states was 56%. So there's clearly some room for learning and growth in that regard when we're thinking about strategically and equitably supporting students of color and low-income students in our institutions. And as Courtney was noting, and as I know Shauna will speak to as well, one of the core components of reaching any goals that we set will be reattracting adults into the system. While it's important to shore up the holes in the pipeline earlier in the pipeline, it's absolutely going to be essential to reattract folks who have stopped out or never pursued post-secondary education in the first place in order to drive up equitable attainment and access to the learning and credentials that will help folks get into jobs with family sustaining wages and with the potential for growth. So again, just revisiting those projections, this visual helps us understand sort of where we would go, what some of those trajectories might be for Black Illinoisans, and I will show the visual for Latinx Illinoisans momentarily. But if we're thinking about what it means to go above and beyond closing gaps in enrollment and completion, that gaps close line in the middle is essentially saying if we close gaps in enrollment and completion, by 2035, we would still be below our overall 60% goal, and we would still be seeing gaps overall in attainment, because again, those are the results of years of barriers and challenges for Black Illinoisans accessing and completing post-secondary education. For Latinx Illinoisans, similarly, closing gaps in enrollment and completion still only gets us to 48.5% attainment overall by 2035. So without accelerating above and beyond closing gaps in enrollment and completion, we need to be able to reattract folks in from who have not completed some sort of post-secondary degree or credential, reattract adults back in, not only closing those gaps earlier in the pipeline. So the journey to establish these targets has been a long one, and it's ongoing. And so, you know, it started with the P20 Council being charged with updating the state's goal. There have been a lot of conversations that have happened through a work group that was formed through the College and Career Readiness Committee, of which several of you on the line I know have been members. We've considered policy and practices from other states and nationally. We engaged the Midwestern Higher Education Compact to conduct that study. The partners, including the Education Trust, have been deeply involved. Last year's HB 2170 reiterated the importance to address these equity gaps. And we've been currently most recently grappling with these data to say, what does it mean to establish targets to close these gaps in attainment overall? So what will those targets include? They will include growth benchmarks for direct enrollment. So enrollment in post-secondary within 16 months of high school graduation. So how are we accelerating the enrollment of students into post-secondary from secondary? How do we recapture adult learners? So growth benchmarks for enrolling adults without a post-secondary degree or credential, including those with some college but no degree. And then how are we scaling up completion rates and graduation rates across the board, both for those adult learners as well as those who are directly enrolling. And then ultimately calculating what that would mean for our attainment rates. So this work is underway, but simultaneously we acknowledge that there is a lot of work that would need to be done in order to get to more equitable post-secondary attainment. And that requires policy, both at a state level and a local level. It requires practice at a statewide level, institutional and community level, and it requires accountability across the board for our state, for our institutions, for our communities, and figuring out how we all work together to achieve these goals. Some of those levers at the state level include driving equitable, focusing on how we create greater equitable access and outcomes throughout the P20 pipeline. So an example of this, again, will be the Equity Journey Continuum that ISBE is leading on and launching this year, and that we'll hear more about later in the conference. Driving systemic equity through policy, that both means legislatively, HB 2170 included some strategies around that. A Thriving Illinois, our strategic plan that we'll hear about on Wednesday from the executive director of IBHE, Ginger Ostro. That is another example of trying to drive equity through policy and figuring out what those state level strategies might be. Leveraging and aligning resources to advance equity, and this means both traditional funding streams for our education systems, as well as current funding streams that are coming from the federal government to mitigate COVID-19 impacts. How can we use those resources to strategically support the students who have experienced the most barriers to education and workforce training? How do we use data and monitoring to help support accountability, but also to help us target interventions and identify who needs what kinds of supports. So that means things like the Illinois School Report Card and the Illinois Post-Secondary Profile sites. It also means kind of one-time reports or renewable reports that can help us understand what some of those trends throughout the pipeline are and where we can target intervention. And then finally, considering what a statewide responsibility structure for equity looks like. What are the roles for things like the Illinois 60 by 25 network, the P20 network, regional P20 network, the Illinois P20 Council? What are the roles for communities across the state for being a part of this work? And again, turning to community levers, communities are really where the work happens, right? Improving college and career readiness requires a lot of work and collaboration early in the pipeline in communities across secondary, post-secondary, and community organizations. It also means thinking about how we're engaging older learners. Where are those examples within the state and outside the state that we can learn from in order to do a better job of re-engaging adults and getting them to valuable degrees and credentials that will help them reach access quality jobs? And how do we share those innovative practices both through this network and other platforms? What are the ways that we can think about that work as something that can be scaled and learned from more broadly? So before I turn to Shauna, I'll just say, we have a lot of great work that we can build from in Illinois with the Post-Secondary and Workforce Readiness Act, with HB 2170 from last year, with various initiatives, including the Illinois Equity and Attainment Initiative led by the Partnership for College Completion, the Workforce Equity Initiative from our community colleges, et cetera. There's a lot of really great practices that we can learn from. So it's about thinking about what are the additional policies and practices that we can learn about and try to implement and scale, but also how do we continuously tack back to anchoring ourselves in the core purpose of driving more equitable post-secondary access and attainment. So with that, I'll turn to Shauna to walk through some additional examples from national partners.
Thank you so much, Emily. So I wanted to take a moment and provide some examples of work across the country that addresses education attainment and closing equity gaps. And what I tried to do here in our time is to give you a couple of examples that involve states, a system example, and then some college and community partnership examples as well. Next slide. And so here you see a number of programs that have been offered by states and individual colleges across the country. And I know the questions, I saw some of the questions coming in. There are hyperlinks actually embedded in this slide. So when you get a chance to get the slides, you will be able to scroll over the slide and learn more about these programs if you would like. And so one of the things that I think is important, and I've curated some of these programs, is so that you could take a look at, the various efforts. These efforts are quite complex, and they involve some degree of outreach, community awareness campaigns, various marketing efforts, as well as other structures built in that really help with connecting people who could benefit from these programs in meaningful ways. And some of these examples include Mississippi, the Complete to Compete program, Indiana, Next Level Jobs, Tennessee Reconnect, which you've probably heard about, and then many other states. And Courtney mentioned Adult Promise programs in her portion of the presentation. And these states have created campaigns targeting potential completers. Then individual colleges like Wayne State University and their Warrior Way Back program, and the University of Akron and Adult Focus, and the University of Memphis and their Finish Line program are also re-engaging adults who may have stopped out. These campaigns have features like direct outreach to stop out students who stopped out in the form of evidence-based nudges, so using technology and scripted messages and ways in which they're connecting with students to move them towards the finish line. Financial aid to return to college, and so certainly, as was mentioned earlier, that financial hurdles become one of the greatest barriers to completion. And then using labor market information and helping students and potential students to understand. That is so important, to understand the labor market information so that they can make informed choices for their own paths. And then various iterations of coaching support. So also adding in that human connection of someone who can be a champion and a support for the students as they're going through the process. It's important to note the success of such efforts requires multiple touch points and contacts through various modalities. It may take several touch points and extended periods of time before adult students are ready to enroll. So even with financial support, you have to give adults time in order to make that decision in their own minds and to feel confident about what they're about to do. Having the staffing and the means of tracking the effectiveness of digital communications is key to knowing where adults are in the process and to improving the outreach and marketing efforts. It's not enough to launch one-time awareness campaigns or communications to students. The adults need to build trust in the process. And we have to also understand that there is a reason that some adults have not finished their programs. And some of those reasons are personal reasons, and some of those reasons also involve their previous or their prior engagement with the education system, which may or may not have been positive. And so we need to make sure that in addition to giving information and having those external wraparound supports, that we're also understanding that we have to build trust and confidence with the adult learners in order for them to take the next step. Next slide, please. And then there's an example of some work that Lumina is actually happy to support, and it's building on the work from APLU. You may be familiar with them, the Association of Public and Land Grant Universities. And we are supporting a cohort of 9 institutions, of which you be interested in knowing that University of Illinois Chicago is one of those institutions, along with Portland State University, University of New Orleans, Florida International, University of Colorado, Denver, California State University, Los Angeles, Wayne State University, who I mentioned earlier, University of Texas at El Paso, and University of Memphis that you also saw on the previous slide. And through the Partnerships for Adult Learner Success Initiatives called PALS. Over the next 3 years, these institutions are seeking to build innovative and more inclusive and comprehensive support pathways and supports for adult learners. And so urban serving universities have long served as pioneers in moving the dial on student success, given the diversity of their students and the unique commitment to the welfare of their cities. These institutions are often at the helm of innovative efforts to redesign traditional structures and curriculum in order to improve access and the success of students of color and adult learners at large. Some of the things that they're going to focus on specifically for Black and Latinx adult learners in order to achieve the following objectives are: they want to increase the number of Black and Latinx adult learners enrolling in four-year degree programs and to increase their retention at four-year institutions, which is so very important. And they're going to be piloting 10 partnerships models to address adult learner success, centering on Black and Latinx students. And we are funding the 9 institutions divided among 3 cohorts. And I thought it might be interesting for you to hear because this is really comprehensive work. Cohort A is actually going to focus on outreach and delivery models. So as I mentioned in the previous slide, this idea that if you build it, they may not come unless we really focus intentionally on targeted outreach and delivery models in ways that are meaningful and that make sense in compelling ways to those learners. And then cohort B, they're going to focus on learner-centered advising. And so how do we build effective advising policies and structures? And then most importantly, equip the advisors who are going to do the direct work with the students in ways that make them better at doing this work with the populations that we're trying to serve. And then cohort C is actually going to focus on holistic supports. And this is so important because having a well-intentioned and well-designed program or set of interventions without looking at the whole experience. We bring our whole selves, I always say, to college. We bring our whole selves to work. And so it's really important that we're looking at what are the holistic needs of the student and can the institutions actually step in through partnerships and other ways to make sure that they are supporting that whole student as they show up on their campus. Next slide. In 2015, the California State University Systems, the CSU, launched what is called the Graduation Initiative 2025. And that was a plan to address equity gaps in degree completion and improve graduation rates and ultimately help students earn credentials to address workforce needs in California. And that plan included the 6 operational priorities that are displayed on this screen to address this work through comprehensive change. And as you're looking at these 6 areas, I think it's well noted that these are things that address process and policy and practice, and also the institutions looking at themselves and removing the barriers that they have in place that make it that much harder for students who already have a challenging road ahead in order to complete their education. As a system of nearly 500 students across 23 campuses, half of CSU undergraduates are students of color, and 1/3 are first in their families to earn a degree. Students come from rural, suburban, and urban areas. 21 of the CSU campuses are designated as Hispanic serving institutions, and 14 are Asian American and Native American Pacific Islander serving institutions. Since the initiative launched, system-wide improvements have been achieved in closing the completion gap for transfer students of color, and they've had increases in 6-year completion rates for equity population students. And the next slide, please. This is an example of Paul Quinn College. Some of you might be familiar with Paul Quinn College. They are a small private HBCU in Texas, and they've been revitalizing the college and reimagining the possibilities of the college experience for their students. Most people know about Paul Quinn College, and they're familiar with the leadership of their president, Michael Sorrell, and his work to provide holistic change to the campus through many initiatives, but most notably, his decision several years ago to turn their football field into a working farm. So that's the Food for Good Farm, which is also a working business opportunity on campus, as well as a source for fresh food for their community. The college has been working to address education attainment and student debt by focusing efforts to reduce tuition and fees and by becoming a work college where students participate in comprehensive work learning service programs for all 4 years of enrollment, graduating not only with a degree, so this is so important, not only with a credential, but also relevant work experience, which is so very important in order to go out into the marketplace and obtain employment. Most recently, Paul Quinn College was in the news for their admissions offer to some 400 high school students in their community, with the unique approach of not only offering the students admission, but allowing eligible students to select 2 family members or friends to enroll with them this fall to earn a bachelor's degree or certificate through online programs. The goal of the college is to have students bring their community with them on their journey. By focusing on helping to uplift the family through education, students can share their experience with their support system. It will be interesting to see how many family and friends actually enroll, but what they've tapped into is the understanding that so many programs focus on offering education to one person in the family in hopes that that one person becomes the catalyst for economic mobility. Instead, they are understanding the burden that can place on first-generation students, and they're allowing the students to share their opportunity with their loved ones and offer multiple people in the family an opportunity at economic mobility through education. While every college may not find this model feasible, there's certainly a need for more programs that embrace multi-generational approaches to education attainment and integrate the support system into the process. On a personal note, I even think about this in terms of communication as we onboard students or program participants in the various work that we do. So when my oldest son was a freshman at college, he was asked during the onboarding process if there was anyone he wanted to share information with, a support person, could be anyone. He listed my name and my email, and over the course of his 4-year degree, I would receive updates on safety, celebrations, academic and personal resources for students. And I even received a congratulatory email when he graduated, thanking me for my support and just wishing him much success in life. He was given the opportunity to opt into keeping his support system connected to his journey, and I could then encourage him and ask him if he was using the resources available to him because I knew about them. And this is so important. I was a first-generation college student. While I didn't have financial resources, I certainly had people who were rooting for me and wanted me to succeed. And so it's so important that we can think about how we can help keep the support system connected to the student so that they have many people who are rooting them on, especially in the most challenging parts when we get exhausted and we grow weary from trying to do the hard work, which is kind of sticking with those programs so that we can complete them. Next slide. And of course, I wanted to highlight the work of the Workforce Equity Initiative in Illinois, from the Illinois Community College Board. And so I'm sure all of you are familiar with this work in helping students earn short-term credentials through one of the 17 community colleges. And of course, this work has been underway for several years and has had good results with getting people enrolled. Of the more than 5,000 participants, approximately 49% of those enrolled have completed credentials of value, and 69% of those completers are entered into employment. And so while the focus on community connection and student support is strong, there is a desire to connect even more completers with jobs. And Lumina Foundation is happy to provide recent grant funding to the Illinois Community College Board to help community colleges strengthen employer connections by developing specific employer engagement strategies, including community partnerships to help students find jobs that pay wages at least 30% above the living wage. So this work is definitely on closing the gap between credential attainment and actual employment. It's very important that we focus, and it's a systems-based view of addressing equity. And this expanded effort on the success of the WEI program is in connecting with adults and helping them to enroll in those credential programs, and then providing them with the support services and expanding the depth and breadth of potential employment opportunities so that local and regional communities are strengthened, and most importantly, those students' lives are changed. Next slide. This example comes to us from Florida, and this is Broward College. And Broward College is a college that has more than 60,000 students through their associate degree programs, workforce training, and they do offer a limited number of baccalaureate programs. And through their effort called Broward Up, and UP stands for Unlimited Potential, they have developed a neighborhood-centric model that brings higher education directly into the communities where education attainment is the lowest in Broward County. In these areas, more than 90% of residents in the targeted service outreach areas are people of color, and they're providing increased access to education, career, and support services. Now, Broward Up utilizes a strategy of enrolling residents into programs that lead to industry recognized certifications. And they do this by bringing the college into the community and offering classes at community agency sites such as the Urban League and YMCAs and many other partners. So by providing the community access to education along with support services that encourage retention, they are increasing the number of adult learners enrolled and earning credentials at the college. So in the fall of 2021, Broward College also received a grant from Lumina Foundation through a grant that we were running called Prioritizing Adult Community College Enrollment. And one of their focus areas with that grant is to help to expand the Broward Up model. And so we're certainly looking forward to Broward being able to continue to do this work in many more areas throughout their extensive service area. Next slide. And as I wrap here kind of with formal comments, I did want to make a note. I love the students video at the start. And one of the things that wasn't lost on me was this idea that students said in their own words, multiple ways, that they really wanted more of the practical application of what they were learning. And I think about this idea of making these human connections that matter. We have programs and services and a number of things that we're doing. And it's all, it makes so much sense to us, those of us who design the work, those of us who deliver the work or the programs, the services, the education. And I want to think about this idea that adult students in particular, and even younger students, there are many students who are younger that we may think about as traditional age students who lead very adult lives. As Courtney went over the demographics and who today's students actually are. And so we think about this idea that education can often it is a benefit, but it is often disruptive to the life of someone where your pursuit of education might be your third priority or fourth priority because you are trying to meet your day-to-day existence. You're trying to care for loved ones and children, and you may work multiple jobs. You may have other things that you're contending with. And so it's very important that we're able, in addition to having the financial resources and these key supports, that we have to remember that in the middle of the night, when you are overwhelmed by life and you are making tough decisions and your bandwidth is just stretched, that you need to have a support system to keep going. And the ways in which we can actually make what people are learning, have them understand, and have them feel that, oh, I understand what I can do with this today. I understand how I can use this today. So that it is less theoretical and more practical about, I can see myself doing this. I understand what the possibilities are for my life. And I understand how I could apply this to make my world better today and tomorrow. That is so very important. And so I just wanted to make that, that point, because as we think about ways in which we can make these meaningful connections with all students, but in particular with adult learners, as we try to reach these goals for our states, for our communities, it's so important that we think about that how we make decisions largely depends on how we feel. And we all do this. We think about important life decisions that you and I make every day, and how we feel about something goes a long way. And in some regards, that is more important actually than data, because when you are trying to think about, can I do this? Should I do this? Can I stick with this? You know, having, kind of being fortified in your belief in yourself and understanding that there are others around you who believe in you really becomes the catalyst for change for most people. So I won't belabor that point, but I really wanted to hone in here, because what you're seeing in all of these programs, whether there's systems change and policy or practice changes, is that there is some embedded aspect of that human connection, that personal outreach through message and through person-to-person contact that is so important in keeping adult learners on the path. So I'll stop there as we, I believe, move into a question and answer period.
Thank you all so much for that amazing presentation. Really appreciated the national perspective and helping us understand where Illinois is in relationship to others across the country, and the examples of how folks are working to support students, especially Black and Brown students, to increase post-secondary attainment. And the data on Illinois was also super helpful, Emily. So I see there's a question in the chat about, since Illinois has significant gaps with Black and Brown students, what organizations that represent those groups is the state working with to close the gaps?
Well, I can speak to the work to establish the equity targets, and then I will also punt a little bit to Wednesday's session with the Executive Director, Ginger Ostro, as well as folks from Lisa Castillo-Richmond, the Executive Director of Partnership for College Completion, which leads the Illinois Education and Attainment Initiative, and Kim Tran, who will be speaking to the Chicago State University Black Student Success work. But for the Equity Targets Work Group, it's been a large something I did not describe is that it's been a very large stakeholder group. Over 100 people are on that listserv. It includes representation from secondary, post-secondary, both institutional folks as well as district level folks, and even kind of directly professors, et cetera, as well as state agency partners and advocacy organizations, several of whom are very specifically focused on issues of racial equity or socioeconomic equity. That said, it's an open work group. So what I will do is, in response in the Q&A function, drop my email address. So if there are other groups that should be involved in that process, would love to have them be a part of us getting those targets over the finish line. And then as that work gets brought to the P20 Council for adoption and updating that goal, that the work can turn to thinking about what those policies and practices are and how those groups can be engaged in the implementation of the strategic plan that will be described in more detail on Wednesday during that session.
Thank you, Emily. And while we wait for more questions to come in, I have a question for Dr. Brown. So the Lumina Foundation's A Stronger Nation report that you referenced in your presentation indicates that gaps remain by race, ethnicity, and income. Can you talk a little bit about how the pandemic has influenced states to think differently or innovatively about addressing these challenges, especially as they seem so pronounced for Black, Latinx, and low-income folks?
Yeah, great question. I mean, as you all know, COVID has been devastating on so many fronts, and higher education in particular, because that's the area I focus on, has been devastated. The numbers I provided, that 1 million less enrollments in the past 2 years, and that was substantial for students of color. So many institutions and states, we're working hard over the last 2 years, not just to keep their students safe, but also find ways to better serve them. We saw that test requirements went away. We saw that application fees were reduced or eliminated. Mental health became a really big focus for institutions and states, as well as emergency funds. And all these helped, especially for our students of color, both to enroll and to stay in. One of the things we hope is that these are not Band-Aids, but these have to be sustainable. We know these are resources and tools that students need to enroll and sustain. And some specific examples, I know in Michigan, they created the Futures for Frontliners program. So they used the federal relief funds to really help those people in Michigan without degrees, working with those essential industries during the height of the pandemic, and covered tuition to pursue a certificate or associate's degree for students. And then in California, they changed their Cal Grant program, and they were able to award an additional 100,000 awards to community college students. So they got rid of some restrictions. We all know with like some of these scholarships, there are these restrictions based on age or time since high school. You have to be immediately out of high school to be going into college. Or only under 20 years old, and as we've referenced, a lot of these are adults that need to get these credentials. So that's been helpful and has really helped their Latino population in California, both enroll in and complete these awards. So those are just some examples. But again, like these were great things that, you know, everybody stepped forward, everybody's working so hard to help their students, but they cannot, again, I cannot stress enough, they cannot be Band-Aids. We have to think about sustainable solutions.
Great, thank you. And Shauna, you talked a bit, you gave quite a few examples about this in your presentation, and I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about how you've seen various institutions interrogate their policies and practices to serve students more equitably.
Sure. So, you know, there are a number of ways, and I think Emily may have touched on this earlier when we were kind of thinking about this idea from like policy from like a state or system level, and then you think about kind of the college level. So looking at the college level, Courtney mentioned, I believe it was 1 in 4 students are parenting. And when you think about a really good example might be institutions that look at punitive attendance policies and classes or in courses and programs. And if you think about this idea that you have a significant population of students who are caregiving, and that's, you know, for their children, maybe they are the caregiver for the family. And you look at multiple generations living together. And when you think about this idea that anyone who's ever been around a child knows that when they get sick, they don't do it at convenient times. So not only do they not do it at convenient times, that you usually can't take them back to school or to whatever childcare you may have lined up until they have been fever-free for at least 24 hours. And in an era now where we are in this sustained kind of pandemic, and you know, anything that looks like COVID is going to be presumed to be COVID until it is, you know, determined not to be. You'll see situations in which we should never put these students in a situation where they have to say, well, I'll just quit because I can't get there. I have to take care of my child. That's a given. So I've seen institutions that have stopped to say, okay, let's look at these policies that we had in place, maybe for good reasons. We don't want people frivolously missing classes. Okay, understood. But we're looking at who do we actually serve? And is this policy actually serving our student population, or is it hurting our student population? Because in real life, their real needs may be, you know, bumping up against this. And are there other ways for us to ensure that, yes, we have students coming and engaging and they're not missing, you know, core content? But I've seen institutions, I can't think of the name, there's one in particular, that their answer to that was not to say no one come to class. They would say, okay, well, they have a program called Attend from Anywhere. So that you could, if you can't get there physically, you can log in and make sure that you don't miss the core components of what you need, and that you're not forced to say, well, I have to care for my family, so I have to quit school. So that's just one very practical example, and there are many others, but I would say that it's important for institutions to look at the policies that they have in place, look at the practices they have in place, and think about the intent of that policy or that practice, but then look at the data and see who it's actually impacting. And that may actually surprise them in ways that they've never actually interrogated before. So it's really important to look at what's the intent of it and who's actually being impacted, and whether or not there's ways that you can, you know, keep standards or keep, you know, things in place, but actually don't make it a barrier to completion.
Thank you very much for that, Shauna. Makes a lot of sense. I don't see any other questions in the chat. And so I just want to say again, a big thank you to all of you for your very thoughtful remarks. Really appreciated the call to action as we consider how to work towards more equitable post-secondary outcomes. So in terms of what's next, our next breakout sessions are at 12 noon. They focus on rethinking post-secondary to ensure adult student success and enable practice and equitable practices through the eyes of the counselor and the post-secondary and career expectations framework. And then the next breakouts are at 2, and they focus on middle skill occupations and financial aid. Tomorrow we'll begin at 9 a.m. with an opening plenary focused on understanding critical race theory and addressing equity in education. Again, please be sure to check out these offerings and sign up on the conference website. And now, before you go, here's the announcement that I promised earlier. So there you have it. We are really excited about the network's new name. As we come to the end of Black History Month, this new name is an important reminder to examine data beyond the aggregate and respond to what it's showing us. We look forward to continuing our work with you to advance equitable post-secondary attainment. Thanks again for joining us and enjoy the rest of the conference.